Burkina Faso is concerned, for more than 8 years, we have been confronted with the most barbaric and violent form of neo-colonialism and imperialism.
This is Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's dictator since 2022. Idolized across the continent as a symbol of Pan-Africanism and African resistance, or rather, renaissance. The tentacles of his popularity reaches across the length of the black world, and for many, he is the ideal of what an African leader should be. Someone finally with the gut to stand up to the West and their neo-colonist tendencies. And recently, he questioned if his country even needed democracy at all, unilaterally extending his rule by another 5 years. Why is he popular? Only when looked at the bigger picture across the continent and its history, the pattern not only begins to appear very disturbing, but in fact, comes in handy in explaining why Africa is still very poor. To understand the extent of this poverty, the state of California's GDP, with about a population of 39 million, is around $4 trillion, while the entire GDP of the 54 countries in Africa, with a population of about 1.5 billion, stands at about $2.8 billion. And when you look at global trade, Africa only contributes under 3% of all global trade, and just about 1.5% manufactured goods are made on the continent. The list goes on. And while many have tried to explain this poverty as a result of colonial and neo-colonial legacies, geography and the rest, what if instead is the very idea that preaches its liberation that's sitting at the heart of Africa's underdevelopment? Well, this is the story of how Marxist-influenced Pan-Africanism has kept and still keeps Africa poor.
The neo-colonial project is alive and well, and it is at its most dangerous, and we Africans must smell the coffee. If we don't, they are going to continue to interfere.
When issues of Africa's development is brought into the fray, a lot of perspectives tend to explain it away entirely as a byproduct of colonialism, using the dependency theories which still persist today. It tends to point out various strong instances of European neo-colonialism across the continent, like in Congo, Libya, Zimbabwe. The list goes on, citing Western exploitation and coercion. This perspective leans heavily on the idea of European conspiracy to keep Africa perpetually poor. While there might be elements of truth to this, it doesn't totally explain other issues like the behavioral tendencies, the cultural corruption, and other elements engineering this backwardness. So I attempted to outline these various theories that tries to explain this underdevelopment, like the institutional theory. If you read Douglas North's work, Institutions, Institutional Change, and Economic Performance, he based his argument that many underdeveloped countries' issues stem from very weak institutions, which often leads to emergence of corruption and dictatorships. Other theories like the cultural determinism, world systems theories, and even Marxist analysis like what originates how Europe underdeveloped Africa have various attempts at explaining Africa's underdevelopment. But not so much has been said in explaining how all these theories is embodied in the ideological posture of Africans. Pan-Africanism as an ideological posture of much of the entire continent makes a simple powerful claim. All the peoples of African descent on the continent and in diaspora share a common history, struggle, and destiny. And it pursues this by first uniting all the peoples of African descent under one identity, creating a common political ideology, which organizations like the African Union is a good example, and establishing a common economic framework. In face value, this sounds like a good idea and should champion the growth of the continent. But when you look at the very formations of this ideology, the holes begins to appear. Pan-Africanism emerged in the early 20th century as a response to racial oppression and colonial rule, shaped by intellectuals like Webb Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. But this ideological evolution was deeply influenced by Marxist and anti-imperialist thoughts circulating at the time. Du Bois himself engaged with socialist ideas later in his life, while later African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere openly drew from Marxist frameworks in shaping their political visions. Nkrumah's neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, reflects clear parallel with Vladimir Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. While what originates how Europe underdeveloped Africa embeds Africa's condition within a Marxist analysis of global exploitation. Through these intellectual things, Pan-Africanism gradually adopted a strong anti-Western and anti-capitalist posture, framing Africa's struggle primarily in terms of external exploitation and class dynamics. This notion of identity politics with Marxist critics helped shape post-independent policies often lean towards state control, nationalization, and socialist experiments, while reinforcing the narrative that located the roots of Africa's underdevelopment largely outside the continent itself. The problem, however, isn't simply that Pan-Africanism absorbed Marxist ideas. It is that many of those ideas had already produced deeply mixed economic outcomes elsewhere.
He promises to transform the People's Republic into an instant paradise through the sheer force of numbers.
Ceaselessly without rest, one observer writes, the countryside is in convulsion.
Across the 20th century, centrally planned economies inspired by Marxist-Leninist models on the Soviet bloc, the parts of Eastern Europe and Asia often struggle with inefficiency, low productivity, and limited innovation when compared to market-driven systems. Even where rapid industrialization occurred, as in the early years of the Soviet Union, it frequently came at an enormous human and economic cost and proved difficult to sustain over time. By contrast, countries like China only began to achieve sustained growth after introducing market-oriented reforms in the late 1970s, gradually moving away from rigid central planning. Yet despite these global precedents, many post-independence African states adopted similar centralized economic models. In Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah, ambitious state-led industrialization and nationalization policies led to rising debt and economic strains by the mid-1960s. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere's Ujama policies reorganized rural life but struggled to generate productivity or growth. In Nigeria, post-independent development plans leaned heavily on state control and centralized planning, often producing inefficiencies and missed industrial opportunities. Even in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the turbulent early leadership of Patrice Lumumba reflected broader instability and ideological uncertainty of the era. By contrast, South Africa, despite the moral and political injustice of apartheid, developed a more market-oriented and industrialized economy, illustrating a different economic trajectory. The broader pattern raises a difficult question. To what extent did the adoption of centralized state-led economic models, often justified in the language of liberation, shape the economic outcomes that followed? Now, the short issue is that many Marxist-influenced systems, by their very design, tended towards a gradual but decisive centralization of power. And historically, that concentration of power often created fertile ground for authoritarian rule. In the Soviet Union, the revolutionary framework established under Vladimir Lenin did not simply reorganize the economy. A centralized political authority within a single party system that claimed to act on behalf of the people. Over time, this structure enabled competing centers of power, independent courts, private enterprise, and political opposition, thereby creating the institutional conditions that enabled Joseph Stalin to consolidate near absolute authority. The logic was structural. When the state controls production, distribution, and political expression, this then becomes not just operation, but a threat to the entire system. Similar pattern unfolded in China under Mao Zedong, where campaigns such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were executed through centralized directives that bypassed institutional safeguards, leading to economic dislocation and profound human consequences. These were not just merely excesses of individuals, but a manifestation of a system in which power was structurally concentrated and insufficiently constrained. In post-colonial Africa, many new independent states, often inspired by a fusion of Pan-Africanist and socialist ideas, adopted similar centralized frameworks, believing that rapid development required strong unified control over national resources and direction. In Ghana, for instance, Kwame Nkrumah pursued an ambitious program of state-led industrialization, establishing numerous state-owned enterprises and large-scale projects such as the Volta River Project. While visionary in scope, these policies were accompanied by increasing political centralization. Opposition parties were surpassed, the press was curtailed, and Ghana effectively became a one-party state.
India's Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, meets President Nkrumah of Ghana. That is, he was president at the moment these pictures were taken. 2 days later, he was overthrown in a coup by military forces. Nkrumah was on his way to Peking to end the war in Vietnam, he said. It was on the day after his arrival in the Red Chinese capital that he heard the sad news he was out of a job.
Economic challenges, rising debt, declining cocoa revenue, and inefficiencies with state enterprises were compounded by the absence of institutional checks that could correct policy directions. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere implemented the Ujama policy, which reorganized rural population into collective villages under state planning. While intended to foster equality and communal development, the policy disrupted agricultural productivity, weakened local initiative, and relied heavily on centralized enforcement, again illustrating how economic centralization often necessitates political control. In Nigeria, post-independence development strategies, particularly during the era of the national development plans, reflected a strong preference for state-led economic management. Large sectors of the economy, especially oil, became heavily controlled by the state, and planning institutions were tasked with directing the growth through centralized frameworks. However, weak institutional capacity combined with limited accountability often led to inefficiency, rent-seeking, and policy inconsistency. In Democratic Republic of Congo, the early instability following independence, including the brief tenure of President Lumumba, gave way to the long rule of Mobutu Sese Seko, whose regime exemplified extreme centralization, while political authority, economic resources, and national identity were fused into a single power structure, with institutions largely subordinated to personal rule. Likewise, in Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, the state's control over oil wealth and ideological framework of the Green Book created a system in which formal institutions were weakened in favor of revolutionary committees and personalized authority. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's liberation movement evolved into a centralized ruling structure where land redistribution policies, though rooted in historical grievances, were implemented in ways that undermined agricultural productivity, investor confidence, and institutional stability. The broader pattern across these cases suggests that the issue extends beyond individual failures to a deeper institutional dynamic. Centralized economic model often requires centralized political authority to function, and over time, this concentration of power tends to erode the institutions, the courts, the legislators, regulatory bodies that are necessary for accountability and long-term development. While some institutional theorists argue that Africa's weak institutions were largely inherited from colonial rule, post-independence emphasis on centralized control reinforced and in some cases intensified these weaknesses. Pan-Africanist rhetoric, with its focus on unity and resistance to external domination, sometimes provided the ideological justification for consolidating power internally, prioritizing strong leaders as a symbol of national sovereignty. Yet, as history repeatedly demonstrates, strong leaders without strong institutions rarely produces resilient societies. Instead, they create systems that are vulnerable to policy failures, economic instability, and eventual decline. Because when institutions are weak, there are few mechanisms to correct mistakes, manage transitions, and sustain growth beyond the tenure of a single individual. Building on these patterns, a deeper consequence begins to emerge. Beyond economic inefficiencies and institutional fragility, these ideological currents also shaped how problems themselves were interpreted. In many post-independence African states, the fusion of Pan-Africanist rhetoric with Marxist-influenced anti-imperialist analysis created a powerful narrative framework, one that often located the primary causes of underdevelopment outside the continent. Works like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa reinforced a lens in which external exploration became the central explanatory factor. And while this captured important historical truths, it also in practice sometimes narrowed the scope of internal accountability. Under leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Muammar Gaddafi, and Robert Mugabe, anti-Western rhetoric frequently coexisted with increasing centralization of power at home. In Zimbabwe, for instance, the framing of land reform and economic crisis as struggle against external interference often obscured the policy design failures and governance challenges, even as inflation soared and institutions weakened. Similarly, in Libya, vast oil revenues under Gaddafi were channeled through highly personalized network of control, where ideological positioning against Western powers did little to translate into diversified or resilient economic development. Over time, this dynamic created a political environment in which external blame could function as a defensive shield against scrutiny. Where power is centralized and institutions are weak, leaders often rely less on performance-based legitimacy and more on ideological narratives that can unify public sentiments while deflecting criticism. In such contexts, governance systems frequently drift from merit-based structures toward patronage networks, where access to state resources is determined by loyalty rather than competence. This pattern has been widely observed across multiple cases. State contracts, public offices, and economic opportunities become centralized within political circles, reinforcing circles of elite enrichment, while broader populations experience limited gains. The result is not only economic stagnation, but also the entrenchment of corruption as a systemic feature, rather than an anomaly. At the same time, the persistence of a strong externalized narrative focusing primarily on colonial legacies and Western interference, can make it more difficult to confront internal complexities, including ethnic fragmentations, governance culture, and policy design constraints. In countries like Nigeria, where diverse social structures intersect with state power, the challenge has often been not just economic planning, but managing pluralism, accountability, and institutional coherence. Yet, these dynamics can overshadow when political discourse is dominated by external explanations. The consequence is a feedback loop. Weak institutions enable poor governance. Poor governance incentivizes narratives that deflect responsibility, and those narratives, in turn, reduce pressure for institutional reforms. In this sense, the issue is not simply ideology in isolation, but how certain ideological framings, which combine with centralized power, can shape incentives in ways that perpetuate the very outcomes they seek to explain. What is often overlooked in this broader discussion is how the ideological foundations of many post-independent African states, particularly their flirting with centralized socialist economic models, rightly undermine one of the most critical engines of development: regional trade. The logic of these systems, much like in the Soviet Eastern Bloc, leaned heavy towards autarky, the pursuit of self-sufficiency within tightly controlled national economies. Industries were nationalized, markets were restricted, and cross-border commercial activity were treated not as an opportunity, but as a vulnerability. The result was a fragmentation of what could have been an integrated continental market into isolated economic enclaves, mini grids of production and consumption that rarely connected with one another. In the Soviet sphere, this model produced constrained intra-bloc trade only for a dramatic expansion to occur after its collapse, when countries liberalized and reconnected through market-driven exchange. Africa followed a similar path, but without the same level of correction. Today, the consequences are stark and measurable. Inter-African trade accounts for only about 15% of the total African trade, compared roughly to 60 to 70% within Europe, around 40 to 50% within Asia. This is not a coincidence of geography, it is a legacy of design. By prioritizing state control over market integration, many African economies inadvertently discouraged the very specialization and interdependence that makes trade thrive. In contrast, Western Europe's post-World War II recovery, through frameworks that eventually evolved into deeper integration, was built on the deliberate dismantling of economic barriers between neighbors, fostering supply chains, competition, and shared growth. Africa, meanwhile, remained economically disjointed, with countries often exporting raw materials outwards while importing finished goods from outside the continent, rather than building complementary industries among themselves. Thus, the paradox emerges: a continent rich in shared history and geographic proximity trades less within itself than with distant economies. And this is not merely an economic anomaly, it is a structural imprint of an ideological era that privileged control over connection. Until that legacy is fully confronted and reversed through deliberate policies that encourage openness, socialization, and regional integration, Africa's economic potential remains not just underutilized, but internally disconnected.
Faso is concerned, for more than 8 years, we have been confronted with the most barbaric and violent form of neo-colonialism and imperialism.
LSP avons décidé de mettre fin au régime que vous connaissez.
Progressive officers and non-commissioned officers attempted a coup on the night of May 11 and 12. These soldiers were supported by a Western state.
To bring this into the present, the same pattern is not just theoretical, it's measurable. In Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, who rose to power in 2022 on a strong Pan-African anti-Western platform, the central promise were clear: restore sovereignty, expel foreign influence, and decisively defeat insurgency. Yet, the data tells a far more troubling story. Since the coup, violence has not declined, it has intensified. Militant Islamist groups have been responsible for at least 2,800 civilian deaths, representing an 87% increase compared to the period before his takeover. Even more striking, insurgent groups are not retreating, they are expanding. By 2025, jihadist factions linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State were estimated to control up to 40% of Burkina Faso's territory, demonstrating a significant erosion of state authority. Across the wider Sahel, the situation is even more alarming. The region now accounts for over 50% of global terrorism-related deaths, making it the epicenter of global insecurity. These are not marginal setbacks, they are indicators of systemic failures. The same trajectory is visible across the broader Sahelian bloc. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where military juntas, often justified by Pan-Africanist rhetoric, have taken power on the promise of restoring security and dignity. Yet, instead of stabilization, insurgent groups have grown more sophisticated and aggressive. In many cases, they are now operating closer to national capitals, launching coordinated attacks on military bases, infrastructure, and supply routes. Entire towns have been temporarily overrun, military barracks destroyed, and strategic assets targeted, reflecting not just containment but escalation. In Niger, for example, large-scale attacks have resulted in temporary seizure of towns and killings of dozens of soldiers in Senghor, underscoring the growing operational capacity of these groups. Even more concerning, reports indicate that insurgent organizations are no longer just conducting raids, they are increasingly embedding themselves within local communities, establishing parallel systems of control and governance in contested regions. At the same time, the geopolitical pivot accompanying this ideological shift, particularly the expulsion of Western forces and the embrace of alternative partners like Russia, has not yet translated into measurable improvements on the ground. Instead, a vacuum has often emerged, one that insurgent groups have been quick to exploit. Security analysts consistently point to the withdrawal of international forces as a key factor enabling rapid expansion of jihadist influence in the region. Meanwhile, new security arrangements have struggled to deliver decisive outcomes, even as state forces themselves have come under scrutiny. In fact, recent data suggests that both in Burkina Faso and Mali, state and allied forces have been responsible for more civilian deaths than insurgent groups in certain periods, raising serious concern about the strategy, discipline, and long-term legitimacy. This creates a dangerous cycle. Abuses by the state actors for grievances for recruitment into insurgent groups, and insecurity deepens. What makes this pattern even more significant is the role of narrative. The rise of figures like Traoré has been accompanied by a powerful viral content, symbolic imagery, and highly coordinated messaging that portrays these regimes as the authentic defenders of African sovereignty. But this narrative often runs ahead of reality. While the rhetoric emphasizes liberation and resistance, the underlying indicators, territorial control, civilian casualties, economic strains, and institutional weakness suggest that fundamental challenges remain unresolved. In this sense, the modern resurgence of Pan-Africanist rhetorics risks repeating a familiar circle: strong ideological appeal, strong leadership imagery, but limited structural transformation. And as history has shown, when narrative substitutes for measurable progress, the gap between perception and reality does not just persist, it widens. In the end, what emerges from these patterns across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and indeed much of post-colonial independence Africa is not merely a failure of leadership or circumstance, but a deeper hesitation to interrogate the ideological framework that have guided the continent for decades. Pan-Africanism, in its most modern expression, has too often functioned not as a strategic tool of clarity, but as an emotional refuge, one that frames Africa's relationship with the world, particularly the West, through a rigid lens of antagonism rather than a fluid understanding of geopolitics. Yet, history does not reward sentiments, it rewards adaptation. That same global system that constrained Africa also constrained Asia, Latin America, and parts of Eastern Europe. Yet, many of these regions calibrated. Countries like China, once deeply ideological and isolated, gradually embraced pragmatic engagement, leveraging global markets, technology transfer, and strategic cooperation without surrendering sovereignty. They did not abandon identity, they refined strategy. Africa, by contrast, has often remained caught up between memory and momentum, holding firmly to the language of resistance, while the rest of the world moved toward negotiation, integration, and calculated partnerships. This is not to dismiss the historical realities of exploitation or the legitimacy of sovereignty, but to recognize that in a world redefined by shifting alliances and mutual dependence, isolation, whether economic, technological, or ideological, is self-defeating. The question, therefore, is not whether Pan-Africanism should be discarded, but whether it can evolve from a doctrine of reaction into a framework of action, from a politics of grievance into a strategy of growth, from symbolic unity into functional cooperation. What Africa requires is not less conviction, but more precision, less emotional absolutism, and more strategic pragmatism. A continent that engages the world not from a position of resentment, but from a position of calculation that understands that partnership is not submission, and that cooperation, when negotiated intelligently, can be a tool of power rather than concession of it. The path forward lies not in rejecting the world, but mastering how to operate within it, leveraging every alliance, every technology, every opportunity with clear-eyed intent. Because in the final analysis, the future will not be shaped by those who shout the loudest against the tide, but those who learn how to navigate it. Those who understand that strength is not in defiance alone, but in direction. Not in standing apart from the world, but in knowing precisely how to move through it. And perhaps when Africa finally trades the comfort of rhetoric for a discipline of strategy, it will discover that the horizon it has long resisted was never a wall, but a door waiting patiently for it to be opened.